Between the time of the printing of the bulletin and today, I changed the sermon title. The title today is Humanize Your Enemy. Humanize your enemy. Let's bow our heads for a moment of prayer as we get ready to interpret God's holy word. Dear God, we know that you are a God of love and that you seek for us to be a loving people. We ask for your strength and your endurance and your guidance in these times as we seek to be your people, as we seek to reach out to our neighbor with understanding and compassion, comfort and guidance as well. May the words of my mouth, the meditations of all the hearts present here be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It's the kind of thing that you might see in a movie, but seldom do you witness such an event in real life. It's every subway rider's nightmare times 2. 9 years ago, Wesley Autry, a 50-year-old construction worker and Navy veteran, was having a day like many others. Mr. Autry was waiting for a subway train in New York at 137th and Broadway around 12:45 p.m. He was taking his $2 home from work, before work. Nearby, a man collapsed, his body convulsing, and Mr. Autry and 2 women rushed to help him. The 20-year-old man in trouble managed to get up, but then stumbled to the platform edge and fell to the tracks between the 2 rails. The headlights of the number 1 train appeared, and Autry had to make a split-second decision, and he made one, and he leapt. And Mr. Autry lay on the fallen man, his heart pounding as he pressed the man beneath him down into a space that was roughly a foot deep. The train's brakes screeched, but it could not stop in time. 5 cars rolled overhead before the train stopped, the cars passing inches from Autry's head, smudging his blue knit cap with grease. Mr. Autry heard onlookers' screams. "We're okay down here," he yelled. "But a guy got 2 daughters up there. Let them know their father's okay." And he heard the cries of wonder and then applause. The power was cut, the workers got them out, the young man who had fallen onto the tracks, a student, was taken to a nearby hospital. He suffered only bumps and bruises. Police later said it appeared that the young man had suffered a seizure. Mr. Autry refused medical help because he said nothing was wrong. He did visit the young man he saved in the hospital before heading to his night shift. "I don't feel like I did anything spectacular," Autry later said. "I just saw someone who needed help, and I did what I felt was right." After the incident, Wesley Autry was dubbed by the media as the subway Superman, the hero of Harlem, the subway hero, and the subway Samaritan. What do you think of when you hear the words Good Samaritan? Do you recall people like Wesley Autry who risked everything to save a stranger? Or perhaps your definition is more general, encompassing everyone who seeks to help another. I believe that's the way that we often interpret this very familiar parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus tells a story about a man beset by robbers on a very dangerous piece of road between Jericho and Jerusalem. It's a place where robbers are known to frequent. And sure enough, a man is set upon by thieves. He is beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. 2 men passed by the man in trouble. One was a priest, a person who was an expert on the religious laws. The other was a Levite who assisted the priests in the duties of the temple. And both were bound by purity laws, afraid of becoming contaminated by a possible dead body, and thus were unwilling to take the risk of coming to the aid of the man who was injured. But a third man does what Wesley Autry did at that New York subway stop. He leaps into action, and he assists the man who desperately needs help. He gets off his horse, exposing himself to the dangers of bandits who may still be lurking in the area. He treats the man's wounds and bandages his injuries. He lifts him up on his own horse and travels by foot many miles to find a place of refuge. He pays for a room where the man can be cared for, gives the innkeeper funds for all the expenses incurred. He promises to return and settle any outstanding accounts. It's an extraordinary story about compassion and extravagant giving. In fact, if we all acted like the Good Samaritan, helping those in need, the world would definitely be a much better place. Do good to others, even to the stranger. That's the way we usually read this well-worn parable. But if you've been coming to church for a number of years, and if you've heard the parables a number of times, you know that there are usually several interpretations to parables. In the time of Jesus, it was commonplace for a story to begin with this phrase: a priest and a Levite came by, just like we might start a story by saying a doctor and a lawyer and a minister enters the bar. People would have been expected to hear that the next person to come down the road would be an ordinary Israelite. That was the usual third person in that trio, a priest, a Levite, and an Israelite. The first two who went by were religious elites, were the ones that the Jewish audience around Jesus would have had very strong negative feelings about. They would have expected that they would not show, that they would show indifference to human suffering. But the next one around the corner would certainly be one of their own, an everyday Israelite. But Jesus, as he often does, throws into the story a challenging twist, because the one who helps is a Samaritan. Now, when you and I hear that word Samaritan, it doesn't really make us gasp in shock. But the audience who first heard this parable would have been horrified by who Jesus chooses to be the hero of the story. Samaritans and Jews did not like each other. In fact, they despised one another. Everyone knew that there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. Those words just don't go together. Saying good Samaritan would be like, depending on where you're at, saying good Muslim, or good Tea Party person, or good communist, or good right-wing fundamentalist, good liberal, or good conservative. So it's shocking to think that a Samaritan, a hated enemy of the Jews, would stop and help an injured Jewish man. Among all those who saw this injured Jew lying on the side of the road, the Samaritan had the best reason of all to say, "What has that to do with me? Why should I get involved with that man?" But amazingly, this Samaritan did not see a stranger or an enemy. He rather saw another child of God. He saw a neighbor. Remember, this parable began because someone asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" That's what makes this charity of this man so remarkable. The enemy is the one who's doing the helping. When we see that the one offering help is our enemy, then this parable really does take on a completely different meaning. Theologian Stephen Patterson wrote a book called You Need Your Enemy. And in that he observes the following. He says, Jesus seems to have it all backwards. When asked what we have to do, he's really telling a story about us lying there in the ditch. And that's the place we ought to find ourselves when we hear this story. You and I are lying in the ditch, and we need our enemy to have compassion on us no matter what. Well, maybe there is something new to this very old, familiar parable. As we hear the story, is it possible to put ourselves in the position of the victim on the side of the road? Can you and I imagine being in that ditch and the only one who stops to help is someone that we really do not like? Those first listening to this story could imagine a fellow Jew helping another Jew, but Jesus went beyond the realm of comprehension by saying it was the Samaritan, the enemy, who offered help. Jesus makes the enemy into the hero, the compassionate one, the one willing to risk all to save us. Jesus gives the enemy a heart, and thus he humanizes him. I believe Jesus wanted us to know that there's a real danger in dehumanizing our enemies. History would bear out his warning. It was during the Holocaust that Nazis referred to Jews as rats. Hutus involved in the Rwanda genocide called Tutsis cockroaches. Slave owners throughout history considered slaves subhuman animals. Jesus constantly calls those who follow him to see each other with an equanimity that comes from our Creator. And when we fail to do that, when we dehumanize others, we fall short of our divine nature. Recently, while we were visiting our nation's capital, we had a chance to go to a number of the monuments, and one of the ones I wanted to take my granddaughter to, who's almost 4, was the Lincoln Memorial. And it was a very hot day, and I put her up on my shoulders, and if you are familiar with the Lincoln Monument, you know that there's a number of steps you need to get to the top. And so I had her on my shoulders, and I got about 10 steps up, and I was really regretting that, and got another 20 steps and 30 steps, and finally got to the top and put her down and got some oxygen and gave her to her mother. And but it was amazing to see all those wonderful monuments to people who've done great things in the life of our nation. One day we took a side trip to Mount Vernon, the home of President Washington, and it was fascinating to take a step back in time and see how the founding father of our country lived. And if you've ever been there, you know that his home is more like an estate because it overlooks the Potomac River. It's a huge house. It's surrounded by a number of smaller structures to the house. There's a kitchen, a place to cure meat, a laundry, a place for a clerk, a carriage house, and several small stables for horses. And then a number of yards away from the main house is a mausoleum where George and Martha and some members of their family are entombed. But further back in the woods, out of sight, is where a number of slaves were buried. They don't know how many. Probably well over 100. And these graves were mostly unmarked and uncared for until 1982, when someone stumbled across a marker. So it was not until 1985 that a memorial was created for these graves, and there's an ongoing excavation still trying to determine how many are buried there. So it took 200 years for people to notice. And as I walked around that estate, I was struck at how such a great person as George Washington, the founder of our country, one who worked tirelessly for freedom, could at the same time hold slaves in bondage. Now, later in life, Washington made it clear as he approached death that when his wife Martha passed away, all of his slaves would be freed, but Martha apparently had her own plans. Upon George's death, she freed all of the slaves right away. There are grave consequences when we devalue or dehumanize others. Once we categorize people as subhuman or less than ourselves, it's a slippery slope that humankind too often has found itself on. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons behind the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement today is this deep belief that black lives don't matter to some in our society. Now, some will say in response to that, all lives matter. And while that statement sounds good and it is true, it fails to recognize the history of oppression of people of color. It does not acknowledge that people of color face blatant and subtle and systemic racism despite the great strides that we have made in our country. The recent shootings in St. Paul and Baton Rouge continue to give credence to this viewpoint. Whether white folk want to accept it or not, many people of color believe that they have been singled out for police harassment and arrest and much worse. Such dehumanizing doesn't just start with shootings, but with what should be routine encounters between police and people of color. A city task force report on the police department in Chicago, for instance, showed, among other things, that black and Hispanic drivers were searched approximately 4 times as often as white drivers. And yet, at the same time, nothing justifies the murder of police officers of any color, as we saw in Dallas on Thursday night, ironically, as they protected people who were involved in primarily peaceful demonstrations. Again, we see a callous disregard for life. And our hearts go out to all who have suffered the consequences of hatred and violence. And this is indeed a time that all of us need to come together and work together for the safety and the well-being of everyone in our society. It is clear from events in the last several years that policing policies must be changed in our country. And yet at the same time, we need to thank the vast majority of those who place their lives at risk solely to protect us. If any good at all can come from this horrible week, perhaps it's that we begin to recognize that we are all part of the same family. Black families often worry when loved ones leave their homes, and so do the families of police officers. Now is the time to unite in our worry and in our grief and to find ways toward a greater understanding of one another. When Jesus told that story of the Good Samaritan, I'm sure that he was calling us to lend a helping hand, even if it means that we might have to place our lives at risk. But the fact that the one who helps is a Samaritan, an enemy, one whose life didn't matter, challenges us yet today to let go of all of our dehumanizing activities, whether they are great or whether they are small, whatever our race or our ethnicity. He calls you and me to imagine something good in the one that we normally would not. Also, during our trip to Washington, we went to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, and if you've been there, you know that it's based on a line from Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech, where he said, with this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. And the monument includes this massive carved mountain with the statue of Dr. King thrusting out of it, symbolizing this stone of hope that's being hewn from the mountain of despair. About a decade before his death, Reverend King preached a sermon entitled Loving Your Enemies. And as he came to the end of that sermon, he said the following: "There is a little tree planted on a little hill, and on that tree hangs the most influential person who ever came into this world. In the cross of Christ, the love of God has broken through into human history. Now we know what love looks like in a world filled with hatred, distrust, bitterness, pain, mistreatment, and abuse. As the hymn writer said, see from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. It is a message from God that love is the only way. It's the only way to heaven, and it's the only way to live on the earth. And if we believe in Jesus at all, we must say to our enemies, I love you. I would rather die than hate you. When Jesus walks with us, we will find strength to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, and to pray for those who despitefully use us. Perhaps the best way for us as Christians is to remember the Savior we follow, to listen to his teachings, to humanize our enemies, and remember that all of us are part of God's family. Amen.